Welcome back to the MMA Business Hour, everyone. We're about 24 hours away from UFC 292, so I want to do something a little fun for the channel. We're going to do a tier list of all of our favorite UFC commentators. Alright, we're going to do 5 different tiers. There's 9 candidates, technically 8, but I want to add 1 in because I think he got sandbagged by Dana White and the UFC, and I think fans really miss his insight, and I love his YouTube channel. Alright, so in tier 5, we're going to go with Brandon Fitzgerald and John. For those of you who don't know, John Gooden does all of the events over in the UK and Europe. I like his energy. He just needs a little bit more experience with the play-by-play, but he's really smart. I like his perspective on fights, but I just want to see, I wish he would get more fights here stateside, but mainly he's only used in the UK. And Brandon Fitzgerald does a lot of the fight nights. He's kind of got low energy, and he's one of the, desk guys who wasn't a fighter, so he has a very different perspective than guys like Michael Bisping and Daniel Cormier. I just think he needs a little more experience too, and I want to see a little more energy from him, a little more passion, a little more grit, and I think he can move up on the tier list. Alright, so now we're going to go to tier 4. I'm only going to have one commentator in tier 4, and that's DOMONIC CRUZ. He knows a lot about the sport, don't get me wrong, but the dude is insufferable, man. He gets on my nerves so bad. He reminds me of like all the gym class heroes back in high school. Man, he's hard to listen to talk sometimes. He's just like a whiny little bitch, and it gets on my nerves. I mean, he knows a lot about the sport, and I've learned so much from him and his commentating skills, and he does his homework, but he just gets on my nerves. And it's hard, like, if he never commentated another UFC fight, I don't think any fans would miss him at all, except like the super hardcore fans that really understand the technical things that he's talking about. I mean, entertainment value, he's like a 5. Information value, he's like a 9. So you bring them together, and that's why I landed DOMONIC CRUZ at tier 4. Sorry, bro. You just get on my nerves. Moving up the tier list to tier 3, we're going to have 2 commentators from the UK, Michael Bisping and Dan Hardy. Dan Hardy got a raw deal from the UFC. He's been getting on, Dana White's last nerve for a while now. He yelled at one of the refs during a fight about an early stoppage that really pissed off Dana White, and then there was some altercation with a female employee. I think he got in her face and yelled at her a little bit. I don't know the details of that. But Dan Hardy was one of the most insightful, cerebral commentators the UFC ever had. I mean, I love Dan Hardy's analysis. I think he's one of the sharpest minds in all of mixed martial arts. He got a super raw deal, and I think the UFC's broadcasts are suffering. He was just so spot on with his analysis and really made you understand what it was like to be a fighter inside the octagon and analyzing fights from an outside perspective. He was able to blend those two beautifully, and it's a shame. Maybe he'll come back to the UFC at some point, but I doubt it. Why Dana White's there. But check out his podcast, man. He's awesome. He is a dearth of knowledge for the MMA community, and I hope he continues to rock and roll and has success with that YouTube channel because I learned so much from him. He's super smart. And the other guy we have on the commentator list at tier 3 is Michael the Count Bisping. I mean, he's got great energy. He knows a lot about the sport. He understands it from a real fighter's perspective, but he's also really smart. He might be a little rough around the edges and, really gives DOMONIC CRUZ a hard time, and he's a huge ball buster. But, every guy from the UK is a ball buster. That's just their culture there. And I think it brings a levity broadcast. I mean, fighting is super serious. These guys are putting their lives on the line every single week. And Michael Bisping brings a little bit of humor to the table, and it kind of breaks up all the, harshness of the reality of mixed martial arts. So that's why Dan Hardy and Michael Bisping make my tier number 3 list. They're both great commentators. I hope Dan Hardy can get a job at the PFL or maybe one championship or even boxing because he's such a sharp mind, and, I'm a big fan of Dan Hardy. All right, let's move up the list to tier number 2. And we're going with Daniel Cormier and Paul Felder. Paul Felder is one of the newer guys to the commentator booth, but I love his energy, his passion. He really loves fighting. He's a very cerebral guy. He loves breaking down the most minutia of details for an audience in a way that makes it very digestible for people watching on pay-per-view, whether it's a fight night. He is just such a talent. And I think over time, he's going to work his way up to be like on the mainstay of the booth for all the pay-per-views. It seems like the fans really like Paul Felder too. I mean, the UFC has such a great stable of commentators. It was really hard to pick what guys went in what tier. But I like Paul Felder and Daniel Cormier at tier 2. DC is such a jovial guy. He is the epitome of what you want from a guy on TV. He is like an every guy that you could go drink a beer with, and fans absolutely love that. He's got a great sense of humor. He's always busting jokes and busting people's chops, but he's also very serious about the sport of mixed martial arts. He's super cerebral. He's a guy, he works for ESPN as well, so he has that show with DC and RC. Not my favorite show in the world. I think Ryan Clark hosting an MMA show is a bit of an abomination, to be perfectly honest. I mean, the dude's a professional football player. Like, Chael Sonnen and him were great. I loved him and Ariel Helwani too. Anybody could host that show. Why isn't Bisping hosting that show? Or even like, I would even take DOMONIC CRUZ over Ryan Clark. I mean, there are so many big personalities. Even John McCarthy would be great to host on ESPN with Daniel Cormier, but Ryan Clark, blah. But as a UFC commentator, he has definitely established himself in that tier 2 of a high pedigree commentator for the UFC. I love when DC's on the booth. He's a little biased sometimes, so that's why I didn't quite put him in tier 1. But I love DC. I think him and Paul Felder, they could, commentate any UFC event, and I'd be happy to watch. Paul Felder, Michael Bisping, Daniel Cormier, they're all, interchangeable in my opinion. All right, now let's move on to the number 1 tier of commentators in the UFC, and that is none other than Jon Anik and Joe Rogan. When you think of UFC commentators, Joe Rogan is the face and the voice you think of the UFC. I love Joe Rogan. I mean, his podcast is amazing. And Jon Anik, man, his energy is amazing. He's everything I want in a UFC commentator. He gets so excited when big stuff happens. He's just the best, man. Jon Anik, his personality, I just like him as a human being. He's a great guy. He's a thoughtful guy. He's very, 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 very intelligent when it comes to MMA. And his podcast is great with Kenny Florian, too, where you kind of get to see him, outside of the suit and tie of the UFC. You get to see who more he is when he's hanging out with his buddies. But I love Jon Anik. If it was just Jon Anik and Joe Rogan hosting UFC events, just those two, I would not have any qualms about it. But as Joe Rogan gets older, he does less and less stuff. He never does any of the stuff in Abu Dhabi or that are not stateside. So that gives opportunities to guys like Paul Felder and Michael Bisping and Daniel Cormier to host the pay-per-views. So that's pretty cool. And Joe Rogan always does the big events in Vegas, and like if it's a fight in Vegas, it's a big-ass card with great fights. And listen to Joe Rogan talk about fights as, that's how he started his podcast, just kind of doing comedy stuff, talking about fights, and it's kind of blossomed into this, global phenomenon. So that's it, guys. We're going tier 1, Jon Anik and Joe Rogan. Then we go down to tier 2, Daniel Cormier and Paul Felder. And then a close tier 3 is Dan Hardy and Michael Bisping. Tier 4 is the annoying DOMONIC CRUZ. And tier 5 is the less experienced guys, Brandon Fitzgerald and John Gooden. All right, let me know in the comments below, what are your tier list of UFC commentators? Do you agree with me? Am I out of my mind? Let me know in the comments below. But I think I nailed this list. But, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in to the channel, guys. We'll catch you guys on the next fight. Peace.